Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 4, Dragon Chapters 13 and 14. Wait. What? Captain Takeo roared at the instruction. She was not about to be ordered on her raid by the tag-along heroes. Someone has just arrived, her spotter reported reasonably. Who? Shit, it's him. The response was from one of the heroes. She thought it was Gunhead. Who? Takeo demanded. If they weren't going to engage in radio silence, then they could at least give her information. Izuku, came the response. Captain Meishu knew that name. He was a villain who'd been put on the police radar as well. He was meant to be a UA management student but also the son of the villain who had fought All Might. He had supposedly stolen several quirks from hero students, or at least that was what the Yaoyazurus claimed. She had no idea if that was true. It seemed far-fetched, but that hardly mattered since the call was out to arrest him. If she could get Izuku and the Yakuza, then. You didn't get to be a police captain without some ambition, but she'd always thought captain would be the pinnacle of her career. But if she could bring in this villain and take down the Yakuza with one raid, then district commander was a possibility, or even a move to a more prestigious posting, closer to the center of Tokyo. She had a Tokyo posting already, but the more central the posting, the more chances you got to prove your worth. If she could do this, then that would provide future options. Hold, she commanded. She now wished they had someone, anyone, on the inside, but the Yakuza were suspicious bastards. Getting someone into them was... Yeah, it didn't happen. Track him, she instructed her spotter. And where the hell did he come from? They'd been tracking the vehicles along the road. It was a quirk, her spotter said. There's two others with him. Do we know them? Takeo demanded. Facial recognition software says one is Himiko Toga but the other guy's in a mask and we couldn't get a good read. Twice, Gunhead reported. The other villain is Twice. If they are here, then this is no longer a police operation. No way. This is my raid, Takeo objected. And those are wanted villains, came the retort. Which makes it hero business. You are not using my men too. Not alone, the hero agreed. We are calling in backup. That was interesting. Heroes seldom called in backup. They didn't like to share the limelight, but was it because this Izuku could supposedly take quirks? That would be she had a quirk. It allowed her to change the color of any clothing she was wearing. It was useful occasionally if she was wearing something that was just too colorful for the situation. She could blend easily, but it was hardly the most useful quirk, and so losing it. She didn't want that, but the police used quirks sparingly, and while it would mean she was definitely stuck at captain level, it wouldn't impact anything else. For a hero though. How long will that take? Takeo asked. They are scrambling now, Gunhead told her. It wasn't an answer. How long? Captain Meishu pressed. At least half an hour, he gave her the better answer. Takeo sighed heavily. Hold your positions, she instructed her men. Not all of them would be as sanguine about losing their quirks, and it would be better to let the heroes take that risk. She settled back, pulling out a pair of binoculars to watch. It would be best if she was seen to be calm. Takeo even maintained that fiction, right up until a gunshot rang out from the Yakuza compound. Move! She screamed into the comm. It didn't matter what villains were there, the police responded to things like that. It had been their job for centuries. It would always be their job. She discarded the binoculars and focused on the body cameras. She had to direct her men now. Izuku turned at Himiko's scream, and then there was a noise and she fell back onto him. He managed to twist fully so that he fell back onto the tatami floor first, cushioning her fall as he grabbed her shoulder. He pulled his hand away from Himiko's shoulder, but it felt sticky. Izuku looked down and he felt his eyes widen. It was red. It wasn't meant to be red. What have you done? Izuku demanded, looking up at the Yakuza. He saw the man hand something red to the man sitting next to him. The guy was dressed in white but wore the ubiquitous plague mask they all seemed to favor. His mask was black with gold highlights. He didn't need to see anything further. What have you done? Izuku snarled as the guy raised the gun. No, there was no way he was going to let him fire. Izuku saw red as Dragon's horde lashed out. He didn't bother to be gentle. They'd hurt Himiko and they were obviously dangerous. 3 of them slumped over, as they lost consciousness. 2 of them remained the same as they were, but the third, the one who had introduced himself as Mimic, changed. The cloak fell away as a body morphed into existence. "Himiko!" Izuku cried, looking down at her. Her eyes were closed and her skin was pale, but she was breathing and he could see that the bullet had hit her shoulder. Against the cream of her cardigan the blood looked bad. Dra. He looked up as Twice's shadow fell over them. The man didn't appear to know what to say. "It's a shoulder wound," Izuku told him, forcing himself to take a deep breath. Himiko would be fine. She'd recover and then… "Take her," he instructed. Gently holding her out. Twice took her and Izuku was pleased to see he was gentle. He almost gingerly held her as Izuku looked over to the Yakuza. He could hear shouting coming from outside, but he was curious as to what they had been using. "Do you know what is happening?" he asked Twice, gesturing towards the door as he walked over to the Yakuza. The one dressed in the white hood had the gun extended. Izuku picked it up. He didn't know much about guns, but he could see the bullet and that's all he wanted. There was something special about that bullet because the boss had handed it over. He put it in a quirk pocket. They'd have to examine it later. "It's noisy," Twice replied. "It's quiet. Did you know this was going to happen?" Izuku asked as he turned back. The villain emphatically shook his head. From the way his mask stretched, Izuku could see that his eyes were wide with worry. It felt genuine and Izuku was unconsciously relieved. He didn't want to have traitors this early. Just as he was wondering what to do, a clear shout came from outside. "Stop! Police!" There was a pounding of feet on the wooden balcony. Izuku sighed. "I liked those boots," he murmured. Their shoes had been left at the front door and if the police were here then they weren't getting them back. Except he really shouldn't be worried about that yet. They had to get out of here first. Calling Kurogiri would be the easiest way, but he felt as if he couldn't always call upon the warp gate to get him out of trouble. There would be times when he had to fight in the future and he should practice now. If he couldn't extradite himself from a police raid then he really shouldn't be leading. Izuku sensed more than saw the attack coming and he lashed out, both physically and with Dragon's Horde. There was a heavy thump and he stared, somewhat dumbly down at the body. It was a hero. He frowned and then looked around the room. One of the doors was open, which told him how Gunhead had gotten in. Izuku shook his head. "We have to get out of here," he announced. Twice nodded. Izuku sent a burst of air towards the door and closed it. "How many clones of us can you make?" he asked. "About 5. "Just 5? 5 sets of us," Twice clarified. Izuku nodded. "Can they use my quirks?" he asked. He should have done some experimentation earlier. They would have to rectify that when they got back. Under his mask, Izuku could tell Twice was thinking. They usually can use a quirk, but his expression was doubtful under the mask. "You don't know if they can take multiple," Izuku finished and sighed. "It doesn't really matter," he decided after a moment of thought. "We just need them to run in other directions so that when we run, the police and heroes won't know which is the right group to follow," he explained. Twice nodded and then shifted Himiko slightly to hold out his hand. Izuku took it and before long the room was completely filled with copies of them. "Ready?" Twice prompted. "Just a sec," Izuku hesitated. "Ochako liked Gunhead," he said, turning back to the hero. Gunhead was a patrol hero but his stats weren't that bad and Ochako had done her internship with him. He brought the hero's quirk to the front of mind. It was the same gray color as the hero's helmet. Izuku flicked his hand towards the hero, returning his quirk, before he grinned. Eventually, the Yakuza would wake up and realize they had lost their quirks. They might report to the police what had happened, but with Gunhead having his quirk back, it should confuse the issue. Izuku frowned. It was interesting. When he reached out he couldn't know. He couldn't think on that now, but it was something to discuss with Twice when they practiced. And no, he could not get distracted again. "Ready," he confirmed. "Come stand with me," Izuku instructed and waited for Twice to come closer. When the other man had come close he made a platform and lifted them into the air slightly. He could tell Twice was slightly concerned but he didn't tense too much. That was good. "Oh." Izuku realized and shot his hand out towards the Yakuza. Chain snapped out and wrapped around them. It was making it easier for the police, but he didn't need their leaders getting away and exacting revenge. And come to think of it, there would be underlings. Another thought for when he was out of here. "Let's go," Izuku announced to avoid getting distracted again. He looked up at the ceiling. Was this a one-story or two-story house? He couldn't remember. He thought it was one story. If it was two, they'd just have to punch through it again. Everyone ready? He asked. There was a chorus of yes from the clones. Go! Izuku yelled as he formed a solid barrier around him and shot upwards. It wasn't how she'd planned the raid, but Captain Takeo Meishu didn't think it was going too badly. Thankfully, there had only been one gunshot and her men were still trying to figure out where it had come from. The heroes. She had no real idea where they were. Gunhead had been only a step behind her men and then they reported that he'd disappeared. They were nearing the inner rooms now, and while the Yakuza had fought back, they didn't seem organized. She'd call them distracted, but she had no idea what was causing that. She didn't care either. They were taking them into custody, so it didn't matter. Equally important, the Yakuza weren't launching a counter-attack. We've surrounded the presentation room, the update came as expected. What the hell? The call wasn't something she expected to hear. Before she could demand an explanation, it became clear. The roof of the Yakuza house exploded upwards and two things emerged out of the dust. From the presentation room, the traditional sliding paper doors blew outwards, and as she watched, people leaped through them. They broke into four groups and ran in different directions. What the hell? Takeo echoed her officers. The groups were identical. There were three in each group. It was the three villains who had arrived earlier. The villain the heroes had told her was named Izuku. Now Takeo could get a good look at him, from almost every angle. He was dressed in what looked to be black biker leathers with green highlights. It matched his eyes and hair, and he was young. Villains were getting younger all the time. The villain, Izuku, was with another man. That villain was wearing a skin-tight suit, complete with mask, and was carrying the third. She was young and was dressed in a high school uniform, except she appeared to be unconscious and bleeding from one shoulder. Was that the gunshot that had started this? Takeo shook herself. Capture them, she ordered over the radio network. And find Gunhead. The heroes owed her answers. A variety of shouts came from her officers. Two are flying. Someone yelled. Takeo looked up. The two things that emerged from the dust of the roof turned out to be two more groups. They were exactly the same as the others, and they both shot off into the air in different directions. Darn it! Captain Meishu screamed. It was obvious what the villains were doing, and she would put money on the real ones being one of the flying groups, and there was nothing she could do about it. It wasn't much of a comfort that she didn't think the heroes could do anything either. Takeo was reasonably sure that none of them could fly. Capture the others, she ordered again and began stalking towards the house. She wasn't that fair, and Takeo was happy to note that by the time she got there, the situation was under control. Sir, one of the guards at the gate greeted her as she approached. Where's Gunhead? Captain Meishu demanded. This way, sir, the guard said. Takeo peered at him for a moment before recognizing Anzen. What's happened, Anzen? Takeo demanded. It's best you see for yourself, he replied. Meishu glared, but he didn't offer anything further. Show me, she instructed. Officer Anzen led the way into the Yakuza house. It was a nice house, in the traditional style, but she could see where it had been modernized. Whoever had done it had kept the balcony, and most of the garden. There was even a small pond. Anzen led them around the balcony to the presentation room. The doors were a mess and the tatami mats would need replacing. On the way to the room, they passed officers leading out handcuffed Yakuza, but the majority of the force was around the room. They parted to let her through, and Takeo felt her eyes widen at the sight that greeted her. Three of the Yakuza were slumped over, unconscious. Her officers had cuffed them, but the battle hero Gunhead was lying on a tatami mat. One of the officers had pulled off his mask and was checking his vitals. Report, Takeo ordered. Buntai stepped forward. We found them like this. Sir, he reported, gesturing to the Yakuza. And Gunhead? The same, he confirmed what she suspected. Who have we got? At that question Buntai grinned. We got the boss, he told her. Captain Meishu looked down at the middle Yakuza. She'd seen images of their boss, Kai Chizaki. She knew he was relatively young for the seniority of his position and had only gained it by doing something to be previous boss. Unconscious, he looked even younger than his 27 years. They are quirk suppressants? She asked. Yes, Buntai told her. Rather than be insulted, she'd had to check. And he was like this? Yes, sir. Takeo sighed. While it was good in one way, because none of her men had been injured, and they had managed to get cuffs on the boss, in another, very important way it was bad. The meeting between the Yakuza and Izuku had obviously gone badly and… Fuck. Sir? She sighed. I'll have to talk to Gunhead but send the word out. We're probably going to be looking at a war. Takeo told her men. A war? The Yakuza are not going to take our raid lying down, especially if we've got their boss, but there was obviously some sort of confrontation against Izuku and… She shook her head. The timing was bad. To the remaining Yakuza, it would look like the police had taken out the boss. They'd assume the other villain, Izuku, had either left before the raid or had seen it and left. They might blame him but… This was bad. Forget it, the Yakuza are going to be after us. Warn the stations, she instructed. They were ready for this but… Meishu sighed. At least part of her didn't believe they'd capture the boss. He wasn't meant to be here. He was meant to be at their other facility. But they had and now… Well… She looked down at Gunhead. They'd have to see what the hero said but now, it really was going to be a joint operation. What's wrong with her, doctor? Izuku asked frantically. With twice as clone copies causing a distraction, they'd gotten away easily. And one of the clone groups had flown out too, which had further confused the issue for the police. It wouldn't be obvious that he'd flown away, though they'd suspect that. He'd dropped them in a quiet, suburban street before calling Kurogiri who'd warped them to Kyudai. That was several hours ago and Himiko was still unconscious. She wasn't that weak and the wound wasn't that bad. The doctor had patched it up and then said he had to run tests. Izuku had given him the gun with the other bullet. She's just sleeping now, the doctor told him. But what is wrong? Izuku demanded. The doctor turned his goggled eyes to him. You should be able to sense it, he said before turning back to his screens. Izuku stiffened. He didn't use Dragon's Horde to see quirks around him all the time, but when he took them or gave them back to someone then he did, and he could see quirks as little points of light. Well, some of them were and some were spread out, through their owner. When he'd given back Gunhead's quirk, he'd been surrounded by clones of twice and… No. He objected. They couldn't have. He snarled. I knew about it, the doctor said. The Yakuza asked to see Dragon a couple of months back and I sent Yakuni to talk to them. You told me this already, Izuku reminded him. He hadn't been happy but it had explained why he hadn't seen the other man. He reported back that the Shi Hasaikai were working on some sort of blackmail scheme involving quirks. You said he was kidnapped. Izuku reminded the man. He hadn't said anything about blackmail involving the removal of quirks. You might have mentioned this earlier, Izuku growled. You weren't going after him then, Kyudai shook his head. The Yakuza have some way of giving the quirk back after you pay the ransom, he said. Izuku blinked. So there's something to reverse this? He whispered, feeling a burst of hope. He quashed it. He'd felt this before and he didn't want to rely on something that might not work out but… I believe so, the doctor told him, turning around again. Izuku glared at his goggles. He should have been told about this earlier but he knew there wasn't time to tell him everything. And if there was something which could reverse it then… That bullet was meant for him. Himiko had saved him, cause if he lost his quirks… He shuddered. Quirks weren't everything. They couldn't solve every problem. He knew that but for what he was doing, a quirk. His quirks, he needed them. Where are they? Where are they? The doctor repeated. Where is Yakuni? Izuku clarified. He wasn't with the Yakuza, he added. Oh, they are somewhere in the city, Kyudai said casually. Anything more exact? He pressed. I'll get the address, the doctor promised. Now, Izuku said. I need to get the cure in Yakuni before the Yakuza clear out. The doctor looked at him. The discussions were a failure, Izuku told him, from between gritted teeth. I grabbed their quirks but there was a police raid too. The Yakuza will know their boss has been captured and probably blame me, he explained. Or they'll blame the police, Garaki countered. I'd rather not take that risk. I'll get it, the doctor reaffirmed. Though how will you attack? That brought him up a little. Izuku huffed and thought about it for a few moments. His initial reaction had been to say he'd just storm the place, and while he could probably do that, it would needlessly put him at risk. They had the proof that the Yakuza had other bullets which could erase quirks. They hadn't hesitated to use one against him, and it was only because Himiko had. He was going to rip apart what was left of his Shi Hasaikai for her and find the cure. But he had to do it right. He could probably ask twice to make more clones of himself and get the others involved, but again that would put them at risk, and while they had agreed to follow him, it didn't feel right to do that. The Nomu, Izuku said. Tomura probably had a better idea of what they can do, but I don't. This will show me what they can do, and if the Yakuza have more bullets, they are expendable. The doctor understood his logic immediately. He nodded. Is there a particular batch I should use? Take a mix, Kyudai said immediately. That way you will know and will feel what each are like. But you should practice ordering them, he added, gesturing vaguely to the tubes behind him. You still have radio waves. Izuku didn't bother to reply. Instead he closed his eyes and reached out with radio waves. He'd done this before, to sort of feel where the Nomus were, but this time he wanted to go a bit further. He could feel them around him in this warehouse. Do you have all the different types here? Izuku asked. Some of the Nomu felt. It was hard to explain, but they felt sharper than the others. Yes. They are mostly in storage, while I work on these, the doctor confirmed. Izuku opened his eyes. The ones that were the closest felt the sharpest, but he could also tell they weren't finished. He reached out and touched others but then frowned. Can Nomu order Nomu? He murmured the question. Only the top level can, Kyudai told him. And only the first one is finished. If you take him, he'll want to fight, the doctor added. I'll be their commander then, Izuku agreed. He woke up a heap of the lowest ranked Nomu and then others. There seemed to be a spot that was empty of Nomu, so he directed them there and told them to wait. They would not be fully functional for a few hours. The doctor turned around to watch. You are going now? He asked curiously. There's no point in giving the Yakuza time to prepare, he replied. I'll get Kurogiri, the doctor said as he turned back. And the address, Izuku added. He didn't like going in blind, but he didn't have time to find out about the Yakuza base, and he'd just have to hope he could attack fast enough to stay ahead of the heroes that would gather. The Nomu might be expendable, but he didn't need to give the heroes extensive examples of them. That was just basic tactics. Take care of her, Izuku instructed. Garaki cocked his head slightly. Izuku didn't bother to explain. Instead he walked between the tubes to where he had gathered the Nomu. He had a few minutes before Kurogiri arrived, and it would be best to be familiar with his army. Then. Today hadn't gone as planned, but instead of the underworld knowing that Dragon and the Yakuza were working together, they'd now learned that Dragon would not be taken advantage of and that attacking him was stupid. Izuku snorted to himself. It would probably take a lot more lessons before they learned that, but he could hope. The Yakuza boss had been correct about one thing, even if Izuku hadn't admitted it. With his father in Tartarus, the throne was empty. Of course, Dad would retake it, but until then, he'd just have to be the regent. It was late when Shin got back to the office. It wasn't an office. It was the other Shi Hasaikai base, but he had taken his time in getting here. It had been almost painful to do that, but he had to be sure he wasn't being followed, and it had given him time to think about what had happened. He knew what he'd seen, but it made no sense. The kid had been talking to the boss, and then the brat had gotten up and turned his back, and Shin had watched Chronostasis take the shot. It should have hit, but the girl jumped in the way. Shin was clear on all of that. It was what happened next that made no sense. The two of them had fallen to the ground, and then, from his vantage point, the boss, Chronostasis and Mimic had slumped over. Shin hadn't believed it for a few moments. It was part of a plan he hadn't been briefed about, was what he'd told himself, but the boss didn't move, and then there were police everywhere. He'd watched as they stormed the house and expected the boss to get up, but he didn't. The way the brat had Jin produce clones told him that it wasn't a setup, but it didn't explain anything. The boss had just slumped over. At the same time as Mimic and Chronostasis, but what could have caused them to do that? There were some quirks that could do it, but the boss was stronger than that. Except, he'd just lain there when the police stormed the room and didn't even twitch when he was handcuffed. Chronostasis was the same. Shin hadn't stayed around longer. There was no need to stay. People mocked the police, but he knew they were effective. And now Shin had to explain to the others what had happened. They'd know something was up. The boss should have returned here earlier in the day, but no. Shin knew what had to happen. The brat had done something to the boss and they had to respond. If they didn't, then he felt sick. If they didn't, then the Shi Hasaikai would be a relic of the past. A dead one. They'd go on for a bit, but without the boss. He already knew how it would end. They all did. The boss gave them purpose and direction, and without him. So that would be the first thing. They'd have to get Kai from the police. Then the boss would have them take revenge on the brat. But first, he'd have to explain to the others what had happened, and he wasn't sure he believed it himself. So what are we doing, boss? Izuku jerked his head to the side. He wasn't the only one. The Nomu started at the noise and then lunged. Stop! Izuku yelled. Whoa! Dabi muttered. The Nomu stopped. The lower ones, those who needed orders to do anything, just stood dumbly. The higher models milled slightly, as if uncertain what to do. These are my companions, Izuku called to the Nomu. The lower ones didn't move, but Izuku could tell they understood. The higher ones looked back and forth, taking in the sight of the four who were there. Dabi was accompanied by Mr. Compress, Twice and Whisper. After a moment, the higher Nomus stilled and Izuku could tell that they had memorized the league. He made a mental note to introduce Himiko to them later. He'd been looking at the Nomus and figuring out what they could do. They each had at least 3 quirks, and were physically enhanced. He couldn't exactly ask them what they could do, but he'd figured out that by touching them with Dragon's Horde he could get a feel for their quirks. It wasn't exact, but it gave him some insights. The Nomu let him move between them without problems, though it was slightly disconcerting how they all watched him. Their gazes weren't hostile, just constant. Twice told you? Izuku asked. The 3 of them nodded. They shot Himiko with something that erases quirks. Her physical injuries are relatively minor, but he didn't need to explain further. Shit, Dabi swore. Izuku understood. He'd run through the swear words he knew earlier. Thankfully, it appears as if the Yakuza were going to use this as part of a blackmailing scheme, he continued. How does one use quirk erasure to blackmail someone? It seems to me it would be better as a threat. Mr. Compress observed. Whisper nodded her agreement. I'm told they have something to reverse the effects, Izuku told him. While it was impossible to tell Mr. Compress' expression as his mask was not as form-fitting as Twice's, Izuku could tell he was somewhat relieved to hear that. But they are not going to give it to me, and I'm not going to pay any ransom, Izuku continued. What about the cops? What about them? Twice said they were there, Whisper pressed the issue. They were. And they will have a nice gift. They should have arrested the Yakuza boss and his minions. The villains stared at him for a moment before Dabi snorted. You took their quirks, he chuckled. I was in no mood to negotiate, Izuku growled but quickly suppressed his anger. There was no point in taking it out on him and his father. Actually, he hadn't said anything about anger, but he'd demonstrated more than once that being patient was better. If he was to act, then he had to be sure that what he was doing was right. And correctly targeted. He should not let people get away with things, just because he wanted instant gratification. He knew today's target and it wasn't here. I don't know what the Yakuza will do, and since they aren't going to give me the cure. Again, he didn't bother to finish. So what do you know about the target? Izuku sighed. The address, Izuku admitted. That's why I was going to use the Nomu. The Yakuza won't have many bullets that erase quirks, and if a Nomu gets hit then… He shrugged. He wasn't quite as casual about it as he seemed. The Nomu were people. Had been people, but his father had ordered them created for a reason, and if he was going to get his father out of Tartarus then he'd need them, but he also needed to know what they could do so he could plan that mission. This would be good practice. What is the address? Mr. Compress asked. The doctor has it, Izuku admitted. The magician dipped his top hat. Then I will ask him and see what can be learned. There should be someone on the inside, Izuku said. But I don't know what situation they will be in, he added. So I can't expect support. He could sense Compress thinking. Twice, can you make a look from memory? The magician asked. Izuku frowned, wondering where he was going. The question seemed to surprise Twice as well because the man was silent for a few moments. Maybe if it was familiar, he answered slowly. Police? Riot police? Mr. Compress prompted. Ah, Izuku nodded. If you can, that would be helpful, he said. He was also curious to see Twice's quirk work again. There was something odd about the clones. He'd noticed that first at the Yakuza house but had been more focused on escaping and on ignoring the evidence Dragon's Horde had him see in Himiko. He could see what Mr. Compress was suggesting now. They could leave the police clones of Twice around the perimeter, which would at least slow down any investigation and reassure the public that what they were doing was legal. Twice frowned, before a clone popped into existence. It was obviously Twice, and Whisper covered her mouth to muffle her silent giggle. The copy was dressed half in a regular police uniform and half in Twice's costume. His face was Jin's. Izuku sighed. "We'll keep that idea in reserve," he murmured, firmly pushing aside the disappointment he felt. "I'm sorry," Twice said, hanging his head. "We'll just do this the way I was going to," Izuku dismissed. "And I know you didn't mean for the Shi Hasaikai to attack." He added. If he thought that Twice had set him up, the man wouldn't be here. "A confrontation between us was inevitable, given their plan, and far better for us that it happened now, rather than giving them time to prepare." They'd already had too much time to prepare. "How do these things work?" Dabi asked, gesturing to the Nomu. "You give them orders, they carry them out," Izuku told them. "How strong are they?" Izuku grinned. While UA had suppressed information about the incident as their unforeseen simulation joint, they hadn't managed to suppress everything, not when Tomura also advertised the Nomu's existence at Hosu and again at Kamino. There wasn't much footage of them at either location, but there was enough that speculation was all over the net. "Strong enough to wipe out some pesky Yakuza," he replied. "What about pesky heroes?" Dabi pressed. "Depending on the hero, and the Nomu, no problems. But rather than just unleash them on a hero, customization is called for." The first Nomu was customized to fight All Might. Did it win? Whisper murmured her question. "No," Izuku admitted. "But it did push All Might into his weak form," he explained. When he'd spoken to Tomura about that mission, he'd worked out that his dad hadn't intended for Tomura to succeed. But he couldn't readily admit that here, not yet. And no matter how that had turned out, it had shown that the Nomu was strong. "So if one went up against Endeavor?" Dabi mused. "I'd want to make sure it had a fireproofing quirk," Izuku interrupted before the fire villain could get lost in his thoughts. "But for now, these are going up against the Shi Hasaikai. Do you want us to order them?" Mr. Compress asked. "Maybe initially, but I have a quirk to guide them once they are in," Izuku said. "You can call it cowardly if you want, but I'm not going to take the same risk as earlier." He could see the villains think about that for a moment before they nodded. Then perhaps, once the Shi Hasaikai are captured, it would be best to present a united front, Mr. Compress suggested. Izuku thought about that for a moment before he smiled. To show off Dragon's reach? He gave his own proposal. The magician smiled. Izuku could tell that much under his mask. Indeed, to show off Dragon's reach. "It should be educational for the world," he added. Izuku looked at each of them and smiled. "I'll order some of the Nomu to obey you, but I want you all to be careful. The smart ones will run, but since I suspect the Shi Hasaikai are short of funds, this could be their last stronghold, so they'll want to hold on to it. If any of them fight, capture them and bring them to me. I want to chat, but the aim is to secure the place quickly so that we can find the cure. We have to assume the heroes will be alerted to the attack as we begin, so we will have to be quick. But they aren't going to get away with this." He got nods from the group, and Izuku thought that perhaps they'd been cooped up too long. "Then let's go." End. The Emperor's Dragon Part 4, Dragon, Chapters 13 and 14. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe. Join me for the next chapters. Or check out my other works.